Morning. Oops. Help if I selected the right file here. Now what's going on? There we go. I don't know what happened there. I don't know what's going on. Hold still. I'm having some technical issues here. All right, hold still. I don't know why it is acting up the way it is. Well, all right, we'll try this again. There we go. That seems to work. All right. I apologize for those issues there. As sad as it may seem, I think we're going to end up wrapping up World War I today. And I know it seems quick, but again, this is just a survey course, and I've taken semester-long courses just on World War I. So there's a whole ton we could have gotten into, but obviously, time constraints that I can't get into. So between the end of 1915 and the beginning of 1916, with the war in full swing, France and Great Britain kind of saw the writing on the wall, were convinced they were going to win. And what do we do with the losers? Remember, the Ottoman Empire had joined the Triple Alliance. And, so they were on Germany and Austria-Hungary's side during the war. And the question was, well, they were already the old sick man of Europe. What are we going to do with their lands after the war is done? Particularly since with this new mechanized age and the discovery of oil in these lands. So the France and Great Britain held a series of secret meetings to draw up plans for the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire following an Allied victory. Russia was also involved in the negotiations to a small degree. The result of these negotiations between the foreign minister of Great Britain, a guy named Sykes, and the foreign minister of France, a guy named Picot, was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or the Asia Minor Agreement. And the agreement divided up spheres of influence between France and Great Britain. Portions of what is now Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon were divided up between the British and the French. Russia also was allowed to get a small portion of land in Turkey. So the secret agreement was named after the French diplomat Francois-Georges Picot and British Sir Mark Sykes. And although the agreement was drawn up in secret, it came to light when the Bolsheviks blabbed. And we haven't gotten to the Russian Revolution yet, but basically during the war, the Tsar was overthrown, a new government led by a group known as the Bolsheviks took over. The Bolsheviks didn't feel like they were getting their fair share, and so they told the rest of the world about this secret meeting. See, following the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Allies refused to honor the agreement with the new Bolshevik government, and this made the Bolsheviks mad. And to get back at their former allies, a copy of the agreement was printed in the communist newspaper Pravda. In November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Jewish leader Walter Rothschild. And this letter has come to be known as the Balfour Declaration. In the letter, Balfour expressed Great Britain's support for a Jewish state in the region of Palestine. And the Balfour Declaration ultimately led to the League of Nations granting Great Britain control over the region under the Palestinian Mandate of 1922. Before I get to the Zimmerman telegram, let me focus on, the importance of Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, because what are two of the main reasons there's trouble in the Middle East today? One, a lot of these Bedouin tribes that cause a lot of trouble, they don't recognize these country borders. Take the Kurds, for example. The Kurds are just a huge tribe of people, kind of limited to the north of Iraq and, in other places, Jordan. They kind of cross borders, but they're a people. They have their own language, their own culture, and we didn't recognize their nationality, their regional differences, and give them their own place. We just kind of drew some lines and said, okay, this one's French, this one's English, and now you're stuck here. And that's caused a lot of problems into today. The other thing, the Balfour Declaration, is one of the other main problems is the existence of the Jewish Israeli state in the Middle East that upsets a lot of Muslims. They basically were just told, you got to remember, the Jews hadn't been back to Israel, their homeland, for hundreds of years. And so they were basically told, hey, now here's a land for you. Well, what about the people who are already living there? So these things have caused some problems. So now we're going to get into the Zimmerman telegram and the bringing in the United States into World War I. And the interception of the Zimmerman telegram, or the Zimmerman note, was an important event that helped sway American opinion toward intervention in World War I. Remember, up until April 1917, the United States has stayed out of the war. So what was the Zimmerman telegram? It was a telegram sent in January 1917 from Germany to Mexico, inviting Mexico to join the Central Powers. Mexico and the United States had had a history since the early 19th century of border conflict. And since the Mexican War in 1848, the United States had always held the upper hand militarily in this conflict, and it had absorbed a lot of northern Mexican territory, including California and Texas, into the United States, which upset a lot of Mexicans, probably. And so when it's considered that the United States may enter the war on the side of the allies, the Triple Entente, the Germans decide, okay, well, to maybe keep them at home, we'll open a war on another front by inviting Mexico to, basically declare war or cause problems on the southern border. Now, there were already problems on the southern border because Mexican, revolutionaries were invading southern United States, taking things, crossing the Rio Grande, the sort of border between those, back into Mexico. And the United States Army, actually, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment that I was a part of, was formed for the purpose of going into Mexico to chase these banditos down and capturing them. So the telegram was sent in January 1917 from Germany to Mexico, inviting Mexico to join the Central Powers. And in return for Mexican collaboration, Germany promised to assist Mexico in reconquering portions of the American Southwest. The telegram was named after German State Secretary of Foreign Affairs Arthur Zimmerman, and it was intercepted by the British and passed on to the United States. The telegram also indicated Germany would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which had been temporarily halted in order to not offend the United States. Now, you can imagine how outraged Americans were upon learning about Germany's secret plan to incite Mexican collaboration, particularly over all the struggles they'd had for the past century. Needless to say, Mexico turned down Zimmerman's offer because they were no match at this point for the United States. So now we're kind of getting America into the war. Russia is already in the war. They've been in it from the beginning, but there's problems in Russia. So let's turn our face a little bit more towards the east and look at what's going on in Russia. Russia suffered astounding losses throughout World War I. Modernity-wise, they were not ready for the war. They literally, their only benefit in the war, their only strength was they had a huge population. So they're literally throwing their population with pitchforks to go to battle against machine guns. So the unpopularity of the war helped bring about the Russian Revolution of 1917, resulting in the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the installment of a socialist government. Upon securing power, the radical Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin, moved quickly to withdraw from World War I. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3rd, 1918, formally ended Russia's involvement in World War I. Under the treaty, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, were given to Germany, and the Ukraine was granted independence as its own country. On November 11th, 1918, the Armistice of Compiègne ended the fighting of World War I. In a railway car in the Compiègne forest of northern France, German officials agreed to the French terms of surrender. However, the official peace treaty ending the war, known as the Treaty of Versailles, did not come about until June 28, 1919, 5 years to the date after Franz Ferdinand's assassination. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to make territorial concessions, pay enormous reparations, and essentially shoulder the responsibility for the war. A lot of historians regard the Treaty of Versailles as unduly harsh toward Germany and one of the leading causes of World War II. It has normally been seen as a victor's peace. Germany had to take full blame, full responsibility for the war and all the damage the war had caused and repay it back. A lot of historians also cite the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles as a major cause of the rise of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialism during the 1920s and 1930s. Matter of fact, this photograph I have here, at the train car where the surrender was signed, each country had an honor guard of soldiers there. And if you look at this picture, this is the German honor guard that was there. And the gentleman, let's see if I can find him. The gentleman seated second from the left. So there's the two guys with the dog to their right, their right, not ours, our left. That is actually Adolf Hitler sitting there. He was a member of that guard. And that incident stuck so much in him that when he invaded France and conquered them, he set this railroad car back in the exact space, brought all the same people back, including, the General Pétain, who was the French guy who accepted Germany's surrender, made them all stand in the same exact locations and re-sign another treaty there regarding the French surrender. So this stuck with him very much so. So by late 1918, it's becoming increasingly apparent that the Central Powers were doomed for defeat. The intervention of the United States and their subsequent 100 days offensive spelled disaster for the Imperial German Army. And within Germany, morale was at an all-time low. Desertion and calls for withdrawal were becoming more common every day. In November 1918, German sailors mutinied, triggering the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. And this ultimately resulted in overthrow of the imperial government and the establishment of the Weimar Republic. In the context of such chaos, Germany was forced to move toward an armistice. And in January 1918, American President Woodrow Wilson laid out his famous 14 points of peace. And the 14 points set forth a plan for post-war Europe. Wilson envisioned an end to hostilities and a Europe reconfigured on the principles of free trade, open agreements, democracy, and self-determination, among others. And his 14 points provided the basis for Germany's armistice with the Allies. So on November 11th, 1918, 11 o'clock a.m., the Armistice of Compiègne went into effect. And the armistice, again, is just named after the Compiègne forest in northern France. At this location, German officials were received aboard French Marshal Ferdinand Foch's stopped railroad car, and after 3 days of talks, signed an armistice. In reality, there was very little negotiating going on. Germany wasn't in a position to negotiate. They virtually had no choice but to submit to Allied terms and conditions. Major hostilities thus formally ended at the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And that's why, in today's European Western countries, many of them, Veterans Day, a day of remembrance, is November 11th. But remember, this was only an armistice, not a permanent peace treaty. Interestingly enough, in a bitter twist of fate, Adolf Hitler would board the same train carriage in June 1940 and force the French to sign another armistice, one that essentially turned France over to Nazi occupation. And one more side note that I've already mentioned as well, the federal holiday we know as Veterans Day evolved from Armistice Day, the annual celebration of the Armistice of Compiègne. So next Veterans Day, be mindful of what happened aboard a small railroad car in the Compiègne forest of France. So while the actual fighting had come to an end under the Armistice of Compiègne, a permanent peace treaty took longer to iron out. The Paris Peace Conference began in January 1919 and lasted roughly a year. The goal of the conference was to secure a lasting European peace, one that would hopefully prevent future wars from breaking out. The conference was a major diplomatic event with over 30 countries represented, but among the leading figures at the conference were Georges Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States. And these leaders are sometimes referred to as the Big Four. President Wilson suggested a peace centered around his 14 points. He also promoted the formation of the League of Nations, which was an international council aimed at maintaining world peace. And you can kind of think of it as the precursor to the United Nations, which is what it was. So as much as President Wilson championed the League of Nations, the United States ended up not joining because it required a treaty. And under American law, treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. And the US Senate voted down American participation in Wilson's beloved league for two main reasons. One, they were tired of being involved in international conflict, and that's what they saw World War I as, a conflict that really didn't concern the United States and that we should be out of it and away from Europe. Number two, Woodrow Wilson, when he came back from the Paris Peace Conference, suffered a major stroke and was not able to push and promote his plan as effectively as he would like. So the Treaty of Versailles formally ended World War I, and it was signed June 28, 1919, 5 years to the date of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And just as in the Armistice of Compiègne, Germany had virtually no room for negotiations. The ravaged nation was basically forced to accept whatever treaty it was presented with. One of the most controversial conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was outlined in Article 231, also known as the War Guilt Clause. And this section required Germany to take full responsibility for all damage done throughout the war. It also required Germany to make territorial concessions and pay enormous reparations. Requirements for disarmament and limitations on military capabilities were also written in. Basically, it was an admission of guilt. The war was Germany's fault. And Article 231 was written by U.S. diplomats Norman Davis and John Foster Dulles, who, if you ever fly into Washington, D.C., to Dulles International Airport, that's who that's named after. But the general consensus among historians is that the Treaty of Versailles was unduly harsh toward Germany, and this harshness is one of the major causes of World War II. So it has normally been seen as a victor's peace, and many historians cite the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles as a major cause of the rise of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialism during the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of people don't realize that the United States did not actually accept the Treaty of Versailles. So while other European countries agreed to it, the US Senate failed to ratify the treaty. And as a result, peace between Germany and the United States was not technically in place until the Treaty of Berlin in 1921. Of course, most textbooks fail to mention this. So World War I shook the world. Never before had technology been put to such destructive ends. Never before had a war been so global in scope. And although the guns fell silent following the Armistice of Compiègne in November of 1918, the impact of the war actually continues to be felt to this day. The war resulted in the death of empires and the birth of nations, and in national boundaries being redrawn around the world. It ushered in prosperity for some countries while it brought economic depression to others. It influenced literature, it changed culture. The impact of World War I was, to say the least, monumental. So let's explore the political, economic, and social consequences of the Great War. We'll start with the political impacts of World War I. There's a lot that can be said of the political effects of World War I, so we'll try to focus on the highlights. And this will be rather rapid fire in terms of content, so hang on tight. Here we go. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to make significant territorial concessions, and these were primarily among its eastern and western borders. Probably the most important concession was the ceding of Alsace and Lorraine to France, and this area had been the subject of dispute between France and Germany for a long time. And there's a lot that can be said of the political effects, so I don't know why I had this twice, but this area bordering the two countries had been ceded to Germany following its victory in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and for decades afterwards, France wanted it back. It's very rich in resources like coal and iron and things like that. So emerging as victorious powers in World War I, France and Great Britain jointly controlled Saarland for a period of 15 years. Other parts of Germany were given to the newly independent countries of Poland and to Denmark. Coinciding with the end of World War I, a socialist revolution broke out in Germany. The German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, which resulted in the creation of the left-leaning Weimar Republic, which lasted until Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party seized power in the early 1930s. And a lot of historians believe Germany's defeat in World War I and the harsh terms imposed by the Treaty of Versailles led directly to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. So following its defeat, the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up into several independent states. Among the most prominent were Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria. The Ottoman Empire also split apart. Portions of the former empire were placed under the control of France and Great Britain, such as Syria and Palestine, while the bulk of the empire emerged as the Republic of Turkey. And discontent with World War I also helped bring about the Russian Revolution of 1917. In this revolution, the Russian Empire was toppled and replaced by a socialist government led by Vladimir Lenin. In northeastern Europe, new states emerged that had formerly been a part of the Russian Empire, and among them were Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania. And we should understand that mandates, territorial concessions, and independence movements took place throughout the world, not just in Europe. For example, the League of Nations mandated that the colony of German East Africa be partitioned to Belgium, France, and Portugal. So while the specifics of how post-World War I nation states emerged is quite complex, the important thing to remember is that after World War I, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires fractured into numerous independent nations. It can be argued convincingly that the United States emerged from World War I as the world superpower. And because of U.S. intervention and President Woodrow Wilson's diplomatic leadership, America had now become the savior of Europe. And the United States left World War I with a major confidence boost. Now we're going to look at the economic impacts of World War I. And unlike in some European countries, the United States was not laid to waste by war. America's factories and countrysides were unharmed and performing better than ever because they were providing all the supplies for the war. World War I sped up American industrial production, leading to an economic boom throughout the Roaring '20s. So while the war was a devastating experience for France and the United Kingdom, these countries were able to recover economically without too much difficulty because of help from the United States. It was Germany, however, that particularly suffered following the war. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was required to make monetary payments to the Allies called reparations. And the heavy reparations, combined with the devastated economic infrastructure throughout Germany and political tension under the Weimar Republic, led to an economic depression. A lot of people thought, hey, to pay these reparations, why don't we just print the money and just give them the cash? And that's what the Weimar Republic did. They printed a ton of money. The trouble is this leads to a concept called hyperinflation and unemployment. Why? Money was so easy to get. There was so much of it. Why should I go to work? So there's lots of unemployment. To get someone to work, you actually have to offer them a whole lot more money, which means your input costs go up. So you have to charge a whole lot more for your product. This is hyperinflation. And so what people literally, this is no joke, you can find pictures of this, to buy a loaf of bread, you actually needed a wheelbarrow full of German marks. So, this is staggering. These Reichsmarks, the German currency, became so devalued, like I said, that it took wheelbarrows full of money to buy basic items such as a loaf of bread. One famous photograph that I have down here shows children flying a kite made out of Reichsmarks sewn together. That's how easy money was to come by. Can you imagine today giving your kids a couple $100s to make a kite out of? Heck no. But it was like that then. And I've got other pictures on my website, kids building forts out of stacks of cash. So in the mid to late 1920s, the German economy stabilized somewhat. But after the American stock market crash in 1929, the Great Depression spread to Germany. So from 1929 into the early 1930s, depression again wreaked havoc on German society. And it was under these conditions that the Nazis were able to come to power. So let's talk about the social impacts of World War I. World War I had important effects on society at large as well. Some of you may watch the television series Downton Abbey, and this program does a good job of showing how World War I disrupted decades of social norms. Generally, the war brought an increase in progressive thinking. In many parts of the world, opportunities for lower and middle class people improved, while members of the aristocracy sometimes found their power waning. Of course, this is not true across the board, but the general trend following the war was toward liberalization. During the war, many women took on tasks that previously had been relegated to men. And the disruption of social norms during the war aided the cause of feminism, which grew throughout the 1920s. But with the war over, technological advances could now be put toward peaceful purposes. So improved means of transportation, mechanical progress, advances in communication and medicine all helped to improve the quality of life for many around the world. World War I also sparked a vibrant literary movement. Memoirs of the war and poetry about it were particularly common. One of my favorites is On Flanders Field. So popular themes included death, loss, the meaning of life, humanity, other existential abstractions. Ernest Hemingway is one notable American author who fought in World War I and went on to become a popular literary figure throughout the 1920s. Above all, the end of World War I ushered in a spirit of modernism throughout the world, and a lot of people were optimistic about the future. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Imperialism and old systems were crumbling, faith in technology and human progress abounded, and the beacon of democracy and liberalization appeared bright. Of course, we all know in hindsight, this wasn't to last. Roughly 20 years later, Adolf Hitler brought upon the European continent a second, even more destructive war. And we'll get into that in time, but we'll certainly continue to talk about the effects of World War I and that period between World War I and World War II when we come back next week. So any questions today from you guys about what I talked about with the end of World War I? I know it was kind of jumped around, but.
Yeah, so why did they think that World War I would be the last one?
Because it was so devastating. Who would want to go to another war now that they know the modernization and the devastation out there? 1/3, 33% of all European young men between the ages of 18 and 35 died. The economic impacts were horrible. I mean, Europe was pretty much destroyed besides the loss of almost what they call the lost generation, basically. Everybody knew someone who died in the war. And even the people who didn't die, they came back with shell shock, chemical burns, amputations. Who would ever want to go into a war that is so terrible again? And so they were convinced, these wars, they were all about empire. Empires were crumbling. The people were coming to power. And with the people in power, the people, all they wanted was peace. Why would they ever go to war? That was the feeling at the time. And of course, we can look in hindsight and say, okay, well, that's not quite what happened. But at that time, they had no knowledge. They just thought this war was so horrible. Who would ever want to go to war again?
So did the Germans know that Hitler wanted to war to take over the world, kind of?
Did they know he wanted to do that?
Yeah.
That's a very tough question. Because you've got to realize, okay, after the war, Germany is humiliated. It's bad. People are living in abject poverty in Germany. It's not a happy time. And then in about 10 years after the war, they finally start getting on their feet and the Great Depression happens and they're back down. And so Hitler's rise to power is really based on, guys, we should be proud Germans. We should get back on our feet and work hard because that's the kind of people we are. And it works. I mean, he puts a lot of government projects like the Autobahn into place. The economy starts to recover. So why not believe him? He's making sense. So when he goes out and he says, you know what? There's lots of German speakers in the Alsace-Lorraine, and they were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. We should get them back. There's lots of German-speaking people who are belong to us in the Sudetenland. We should get them back. And so when they hear him talking about these things, like, yeah. And when he starts talking about, look how great Germans are, we should be able to spread our peoples out. And so we should take this great farmland that's not being used in Russia and the Ukraine and make it ours. That makes sense, yes. And you see, so it wasn't that he was going, I will take over the world. It was all rooted in the sense of German nationalism as a people. And to a people that had been humiliated, it made sense. So, I'm not by any means going to stay in here and say the German people were evil and they did this. They were looking for hope, some point of pride in themselves after being so humiliated in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted something to justify their existence as a people still. And Hitler did.
Makes sense, yeah. I never look at it this way.
Now, did Hitler as a person have ulterior motives that he kind of sucked the Germans into? But in my opinion, he fooled them, because it all starts out, I think, innocently enough. Listen, you're a people who have been beaten, but you're a proud people. We have a great history. We should work together to. But I think he took it in a pretty bad. He took that belief in a pretty bad direction, and it took a while for the German people to come to grips and realize what he was doing, and they're still suffering from the results of that choice.
Yep.
But we'll actually get into a lot of that next week as well. So,
Okay.
that was a great question, though, by the way. Do you have any other questions?
I think that's all for
All
today.
right. Well, have a great weekend, and I'll see you Tuesday.
All right. You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.